this episode of Bringing Bias in from the Cold. I'm Bron Williams, a commentator and facilitator on bias and diversity. And with me today is Fusina Aziz, all the way from Ghana. Welcome, Fusina.
Thank you so much, Bron Williams. How are you doing?
Doing very, very well. We are operating at different time zones, but you and I always make this work. Fusina, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do in your everyday life, regardless of COVID-19?
Yes, Hussein Aziz, as you rightly said, from Ghana, West Africa. I'm the Executive Director of Hussein Global. We are a non-profit that's focused on women's development advocacy. We focus on domestic violence, maternal mortality, girl child education, basically all things that affect women in society. On normal days, I do public speaking. I attend some conferences to add my own touch to the fight against all forms of abuses at all in society, and also to contribute towards growth in society. So in a nutshell, this is me right here, and I'm really happy, excited to be given this platform to speak to you, my very good friend, all the way from Australia.
I know. And just to give some context for people who watch this video, Fusina and I met on Facebook. Initially, I think it was just one of those random connections, and somehow, even though, totally different cultures, we're different, quite different age groups. I'm well and truly old enough to be Fusina's mother, but we have just connected, and we've had this wonderful relationship now for, well over 12 months, probably 18 months. I often, because of the time difference, it's early morning here in Australia, I will get a message from Fusina early in the morning. So I might be sitting in bed, texting away, and we're catching up with all the things that are happening. But one of the things that I love about the interconnectedness of our world is that we can understand that despite all the things that make us different to each other, there's so many things that are the same. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to ask you, Fusina, to join me in this conversation around bringing bias in from the cold, because I know that bias doesn't just affect white people in Australia. Bias affects people across the world, regardless of their culture and their national heritage, the language they speak. So how would you define bias?
All right. First of all, you're right. You know, despite and regardless of locations, I think when it comes to bias, it's just one thing that affects everyone, especially considering the fact that we have different, let me say, traditions. We have different beliefs and understandings. There's religion, there's culture, there's just so many things that makes us different. But then the word bias plays a role in almost every aspect. So per my understanding, I think when we talk about bias, we're looking at, if I should say, making favorites amongst a group of people, or creating that atmosphere where one person is either favored or not favored against or in favor of the other. So at the end of the day, I could see a positive outcome as a result of a bias, and it could be in favor of me or against me, but in favor of the next person. So it's not exactly restricted to positive or negatives. I think there are just different views and opinions and outlooks to the word in general.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I had a conversation with a woman here, Maz Farrelly in Australia, and her idea was that bias had a lot to do with our experiences, and she understood bias in that terms of, well, we have this experience, we might have the same experience a number of times, and we draw some conclusions from that. I liked what you said about traditions, because even though Australia wouldn't see Australia as a very traditional country, we're quite a young nation as such, particularly for those of us who are white Australians. I know that I grew up with certain traditions that I wasn't even aware of until I got older and started to think about, why do I do these things? You know, I had the privilege of being able to work with asylum seekers on Nauru and start to mix with people who were not white. And that's when my own biases, which I didn't realize I had, started bubbling up. And I felt a bit afraid of these people who were different to me, not because they're going to hurt me, but just because they were different. And I was able to then go on and go, okay, I don't actually like that about myself. What can I do about it? And then changed. Yeah, because I think it's about understanding that our biases are always there, but we can choose to work with them or have them just prove quite destructive in our lives and in our relationships. Have you got an experience around bias that you would like to share, either of understanding about your own biases or being on the receiving end of someone else's bias in perhaps not a positive way?
Yes, right. I think when it comes to bias, people have so many reasons and their own explanations that they can give to being nice to people or not being nice to people, to offering services to a person or to not do that at all. And personally, I would say that the times that I have been on the positive side of bias has been basically probably because of if it's, I don't know if it's okay to say that their opinion of who I am, their perception. I have actually nurtured myself to kind of serve as a role model. I know I'm still learning. I always say that it's every day is another opportunity to learn new things and to contribute towards growth. And somehow, at the moment, that seems to be an identity I carry. And so the times that people have been good to me, or the times that people have offered to assist or to help have been because they believe it is for a greater good. For most projects that I have done, I have had to personally make some sacrifices. And of course, you and I can understand that day in, day out, people see the things that we do. Day in, day out, they see the sacrifices we make, the risks we have to take to make sure other people are okay, other people are comfortable. Of course, as an advocate, there's a lot you can say about making sacrifices. And so basically and simply, people see that every day. So sometimes when I find myself in places where under some circumstances I may not be favored, I happen to be favored because of these records they have of me or because of these things that they see that I do, right? But then I have not personally experienced a negative, I have experienced, probably not kept them much in thoughts, some negative experiences, but I think I can talk for some people that I know personally who have not enjoyed, bias because of one or two reasons. And I like to, first of all, mention gender. There's just this perception about, first of all, about men being the stronger vessels, physical strength. And so sometimes, in some cases, even in our workplaces, when it comes to times that we have to probably lift some stuff,
physical work,
physical work, precisely, it is expected that the men are stronger and may have to do that. And when it comes to probably cleaning, where even though in some cases there's the cleaner, it's also actually ideally seen. And in fact, most places that I have worked in, that I have met the cleaners, they have been women. So there's just this traditional expectation placed on gender roles. And so at the end of the day, I have people who complain that, okay, so because I'm a man, I'm expected to do this. And also we get women also saying that, okay, so because I'm a woman, you don't think I can be, say, an electrician. Because I'm a woman, you don't think I can be a painter. It's something I can do. And I think this is one positive aspect of feminism, if I should chip this in,
Yeah.
quickly, because it has made more women, especially, to come to understand and to accept that not that anyone can fit in any role at all if they truly and really want to, regardless of their sexes or their gender. And so I have come in touch or across people who have experienced some negative sides of bias, and of course some people to have experienced the positive side. And I think if I have to touch a bit on the positive side, I think the aged is one, which is a very good thing. Sometimes, especially in our public transport, personally, I have made some sacrifices. You find yourself having to sacrifice your seat for someone who is much more aged, not necessarily because there's a rule that instructs you, a law or rule that instructs you to do that, but because ethically and morally, you know, this is just okay, and it doesn't take anything away from you.
No.
You know, sometimes I think not too long ago, I met this man, and he was quite aged, and he had these lots stuff that he was carrying. I just really, I wasn't heading his direction, but I didn't think twice, you know, before even helping him. I just thought it was just okay to do that, especially since I'm, you know, still younger and probably may have the strength that he won't have. You know, so I think sometimes there's negatives and there's positives. We may not experience the negatives at all, but definitely we come in touch with people who have, or people who still do.
Yes. I want to pick up on 2 points that you said there. The first one was, I found that interesting that you commented about men sometimes commenting, but I'm expected to do this. As women, we are aware, like of what you had said about women starting to understand that they can do just about anything. You know, obviously the really physically heavy things are more difficult, but yes, they can become a painter and an electrician. But the flip side to that is that often men are expected to do things that they don't particularly want to do, or expected to fit roles that they are expected to do particular roles in society that they may not actually feel happy doing. They would much prefer to be also, like here in Australia, we've got a lot of men now who are nurses. 50 years ago, you would never have seen a man being a nurse, because that was considered something that women do, and that men should. It wasn't quite manly enough for a man to be a nurse. Whereas, you know, some of the male nurses I've met are some of the best nurses that I've come across. So, yeah, the whole gender bias thing does actually work both ways, and I'm really glad that you brought that point up.
Yeah, and I think, like you rightly said, sometimes they are not exactly excited about these expected roles, but they just happen to find themselves in the environment that make it seem as though they are mandated to perform these roles. I mean, I have come across men who just enjoy cooking, you know, and traditionally people see cooking to be something that women are supposed to do, or women are naturally expected to do. But I have tasted some meals prepared by males that I've actually enjoyed more than my own cooking, you know. Yes, in some cases. So I think sometimes that is the disadvantage of some expected societal roles or cultural or even traditional expectations. I think these are the things that sometimes puts people in some unpleasant situations that they are not exactly in control of.
And I think too, it means that sometimes people are not able to use the skills that they naturally have. Like my middle son is a fantastic cook. My goodness me, he's creative with his cooking. And in Australia, that's not something that is odd any longer. But a generation ago, or maybe 2 generations ago, it would have been. Of course, you had your chefs from your restaurants were nearly always men, but for home cooking, like my son, even though he works outside the home and my daughter-in-law works inside the home looking after the children. She is not a good cook. She says that. And Tom comes home and does all the cooking because he loves it. And I think it's wonderful, isn't it? So that, as you say, our traditional roles, which is where we form our biases often, don't actually have to get in the way, and they can allow us to, really develop ourselves with our natural giftings.
Yes, I think if we have to touch a little even on the negatives, I think there's just this thing that people fail to say, but it's actually a reality. Most employers would be more interested in hiring males than females, unless there are roles that they think women or females will perform better. And most times the reasons, first of all, could be the fact that, how we are naturally created as women, the monthly visitor, and also the 9 months pregnancy period, and also to go into maternity leave. And, most employers can't afford to have to wait till women are ready to come back to work. And so they see that as a disadvantage, and sometimes prefer to employ males than they would employ females. But I think one positive bias is when we look at, for instance, in Ghana, we have the maternity leave. Of course, I believe this is available or practiced in so many other parts of the world, where women are allowed to take a specific period of months off after their childbirth to, take care of their children and heal, and then get back to work.
Yes.
They are still, even despite the leave, are still, given their salaries. They're still paid. You get it. And I think this is one positive bias we ought to look at, because at the end of the day, you do not get to still serve the company, but at least you're being given something to earn, to urge you to help you take care of your home. And I think this is one thing we can't overlook. We may look at the negatives, we may look at gender itself placing some negative biases or playing some negative biases, but I think there are some positives to it. And sometimes we just can't help but accept things the way they are. Other times we hope that maybe with time we'll be able to change a few things. I understand that last election year, some political parties in Ghana here had to cut down costs on the sale of the price of forms, for parliamentary elections, the forms that they have to pay to apply or to register their intentions. I understand some political parties had to cut down costs. And I'm actually yet to verify this, but I believe there's almost some out of truth in every rumor or anything at all that you hear.
Yes.
And if this indeed turns out to be true, I think this is one positive thing we can not overlook, because, and I believe it's basically because when they look at the unemployment rates and the unemployment situation in the country, women seem to be the most affected by unemployment. And so if cutting down the cost of forms is one way by which they can get more women to participate or to take part in leadership roles, I think that is a good thing. And if it is true, then I would urge that every individual or person or any party at all, any government that find themselves in any election year may want to consider this, to encourage more women, to make it easy for more women to want to be part of the decision-making processes.
Yes.
I believe that also there's really a lot that women can bring to the table once they're given the opportunity. So I think it's just okay that we always bear that in mind and have that as part of the plans that we have to do.
Yeah. Look, I'm finding it fascinating as I'm listening to you, Fusina, because we've talked about all different things, but this is quite a different conversation to ones that we've had, because some of the things that you've said around maternity leave and women's entitlement to work, here in Australia, we'd go, oh, duh, yes, of course. But I'm just loving listening to this, because it would be very easy for me to jump in and say, but women should be able to. But, we're over here, we're really saying that this must happen for women. And I think this is one of the issues that we had, that I see around bias, is that, and this was something that I learned when I was on Nauru working with the Nauruan locals, because the white Australians had this unconscious attitude that because they came from a developed country and they had a university education, of course they knew better. And when I sat down with one of the Nauruan women and asked about that, they said, oh yeah, we know that about you people, but we just accept that. And I found that quite shocking, because I didn't like what I saw in myself and my friends. And I think as I'm listening to what you're saying and how you see things in Ghana, it is actually different to how we see things here in Australia. And what you're saying, I would say, is probably similar to where we were 50 years ago here in Australia. But the reality is Ghana is Ghana and Australia is Australia. And yes, there are things that are similar, but there's a lot of things that are different. And I think what I'm loving about what I hear you say, it's about accepting often the situation that you find yourself in and then working with it. And I think one of the things that has happened too many times with developed nations like Australia, we've seen ourselves as the great white gods. We've got all the answers, you know, and we'll go over to Africa or, you know, some other country and tell them what to do. Whereas if we actually listen to what people in other countries, in other nations, other cultures are saying, there's so much that we can learn. Yeah, that's true. You don't have to be like me, and I don't have to be like you. And I think that's one of the wonderful things in life, isn't it?
Yes. I think it's always okay that once in a while we try to pick a few points from other countries. I think that is, no matter how independent you are, you can't really be all-knowing in decision-making processes. I think there are just a few points. If we have to even look at the current pandemic that's kept all of us indoors. I mean, it's been an interesting couple of weeks, and you know, the world went to sleep and woke up to a totally different world. It's as though we are strangers in our own world, you know. But when you look at the manner in which various countries are taking the steps they are taking to ensure that this pandemic is resolved, I think this is one thing we can say we are all actually doing together. This is one thing we can say that almost everyone is trying the same thing. We talk about the lockdown. We look at the social distancing. We look at the self-quarantine. We look at the self-isolation. We just, you know, the frequent washing of hands thoroughly under running water with soap. And, you know, I can talk of so many things. And this isn't happening only in Ghana. And it of course isn't happening only in Australia. This is happening like almost everywhere. So I think whether we like it or not, there will be the time that we definitely will have to learn from each other and then adapt the same strategies to fight the common enemy that we're all facing today. It's good. It's kind of interesting.
It is. And I loved what you just said about we woke up and found ourselves strangers in our own world. And I think that's probably the best description of this time that I have ever heard. So thank you for that. I'm going to hang on to that. So I think this has been a wonderful conversation. I find as I'm doing these different conversations, I'm learning from people each time. And it's just been a wonderful privilege for me, Fusina, to have you on. So as we bring this to a close, is there anything else that you would just like to add?
Of course,
or a tip?
Of course, there's a lot I'd like to add. You've been there for me from the very first day. I mean, I have reached out to you several times about, you know, the projects we have, some of our initiatives, and almost every time you be like, this coach I'm still yet to meet. I just love the fact that we've been able to build this bond, and somehow it's just okay. We have the professional bond and also the friendship, because I'm able to check on you. I'm able to receive messages as well from you. I really appreciate you being there for us. And we are still not sure if we'll be having this year's edition of the Crusade Women's Conference because, of course, we had our own plans. I mean, you and I, we had our own plans
Yes,
last year for this year's edition. But I mean, whatever the outcome, we are still sure that someday we'll meet and someday we'll be able to do much more better things together. I appreciate this opportunity, like talking to you right now, and trusting that you can actually interact with me on this level. It means a lot. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Ficina. So this brings this episode of Bringing Bias in from the Cold to a close. And so until next time, this is Bron Williams.
Okay.
Welcome to Bringing Bias in from the Cold. I'm Bron Williams, a commentator and facilitator on bias and diversity. And in conversation with me today is Chris Hewitt. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, thank you, Bron. Thank you for having me on.
It's really good to have your input today. Now, Chris, can you tell us a little about yourself and what you do in the real world and the virtual world?
I am a communications coach. I help people be better communicators and better public speakers. I like to say that I help people speak with the precision of a fighter pilot and the passion of a poet, because they're two parts of my background that kind of distinguish me. I spent 20 years in the Air Force as a pilot and an instructor. And then I worked in consulting and also in business development in industry. At the same time, I write and perform poetry on stage, and I've been doing that for a bit over 10 years. And a few years ago, I realized that the part of my work that I love is communicating, whether that was helping someone learn a new skill, or it was listening to a customer, or pitching an idea, as well as creatively communicating through poetry and other forms of art. And I wanted to bring all of those parts of communication together and help people harness all of the beautiful ways that language can be used to be more effective and more influential in their work and their personal lives.
Wow, that's so interesting. I am super jealous. I too write poetry, but I just have never been able to step into that performance poetry space. And I have seen many people do it and do it extraordinarily well. So yes, highly jealous of you being able to do that.
It's just something that I happen to really enjoy and have been relatively successful at doing. So I'm just lucky to have those things and the ability to do it.
Look, that's wonderful, Chris. Now, as you know, these conversations are around bias, and I've called this series Bringing Bias in from the Cold because I believe we're all biased. Doesn't matter what age you are, nationality, economic demographic, we're all biased, but we resist talking about it because there's a certain level of shame and perhaps guilt around it. So I want to normalize it. I want to normalize the conversation and say, let's talk about it. Let's bring it in from the cold, because when we talk about it, then we can actually address it and do something with it. So how would you define bias, Chris?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And I don't think anybody's actually asked me to do this. So I'm making it up on the fly a little bit, but
it's good.
It is something that I see a lot in communication, because we tend to filter everything that we hear and see through certain filters. So I would say bias is the tendencies that we have to ascribe certain meanings to different things, experiences that we have, based on nature and nurture. So biologically and also our own experience, our culture, our socialization, things that have happened to us. So it's all about our tendency to ascribe certain meanings or tend toward one direction rather than another in response to something that we've seen or heard.
That's excellent. I'm sorry, I was just jotting down because I wanted to make sure I remembered. I loved the fact that you've said that bias is all about meaning. And that is just, for me, that's so true from my perspective as well, because we are meaning-making machines. We attach meaning to everything, and it's those meanings that we attach, perhaps, as another person I was in conversation with, which I'm sure you know, Maz Farrelly.
I know the name, but not personally.
Well, Maz talked about biases being around our experiences. And I thought, well, that's true too. And if we put those two together, it's about what we experience and the meaning we attach to it. And then I think probably I add a third thing to make a triangle. So it's our experiences plus the meaning, and then the decisions we make around that. What do we do that with that meaning out of those experiences?
Yes, yeah, exactly. And in communication, we, you know, an important concept of communication is the meaning of your communication is the way it's actually received from a transmitting perspective. So if you want to influence somebody else, if you want to teach someone something, or if you just want to get a message across, you need to think about how that person's going to receive it. So often in my work, I talk a lot about how you need to prepare for how other people might be biased and the ways and preferences they have in receiving information. So that is effective from a transmission perspective. But then we also need to turn that inwards on ourselves and think about how we do the same thing. So we need to be conscious that when we're receiving information, when people are transmitting to us, we need to try and remove as much of that bias as we can to get what their original meaning was, because we'll ascribe the meaning that we have to it because of the way that we are programmed and the biases that we do have in us.
Yeah, and that's, I think that's one of the reasons why I love these conversations, is because they bring up ideas and different ways of thinking about that. And I loved what you talked about transmission, because it's not just the words, that we come back to that idea of meaning. It's the meaning that the speaker gives to the words, but also the meaning then that the receiver ascribes to those words. And I had just that experience yesterday. I was in conversation with a young woman from Ghana. She's part of my series. And as I talked with her and asked her about her experience of bias, she was describing a situation which would have been common in Australia 50 years ago, about very designated roles and about how men had to do certain things and women had to do other things. And part of me inside was doing the whole, oh, poo, poo, poo. We've moved on from that in Australia. And I did actually mention to her in the conversation that we are probably in different places as two different countries and traditions. But as I listened, I had to be aware of my own biases around a developed nation as opposed to a developing nation, and actually listen to what she had to say, because this is her reality. It's not mine. We struggle with other things around gender roles in Australia. Theirs are much more defined, just as ours were 50 or 60 years ago. But I had to choose to be aware of what my biases were also automatically making me do, and go, no, Bronwyn, just listen and hear what she has to say out of her experience.
Yeah, and that's to be an effective listener, you need to put aside judgment. You need to let go of your thoughts and just focus on what the other person's saying. And it's so difficult to do, because we leap to that meaning. We ascribe meaning to what they're saying straight away, and you've got to try and ignore that voice and don't judge what they've said. Just seek to learn more about it. And it's an incredibly difficult thing to do.
It is. And I think the more that we talk about this, I'm all about awareness and raising awareness. You know, I often say that awareness is more than 50% of the game, because you can't actually address something you're not aware of.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So have you got an experience that you'd be happy sharing around bias? Maybe something where you've become aware of your own biases, or you've been on the receiving end of someone else's bias, and how you handled that situation?
Well, I think I come from a privileged position, and I think in the business world that I've most recently been working in, I am often on the beneficiary of bias, I think, because I'm, the white middle-aged man, straight, able-bodied, neurotypical, have English as a first language. So immediately people assume that I'm more competent than I am in general. So I think that's a
I suppose that's a nice bias to be on the receiving end of.
It is, yeah. But I did spend 20 years in the Air Force, and great experience. I worked with some of the most competent, dedicated, disciplined people that I've ever met, but also a very homogenous group of people. And because you're training to work in a high stress environment, you develop a certain way of communicating, which is necessary and also a product of that everybody's essentially the same.
Yes.
So coming out of that world and working in a much broader, more diverse environment, both through my poetry in the arts sort of scene, and then in the work that I do now, which was with a much broader range of people who are seeking to be better communicators, I have had to change the way that I communicate. And I noticed that I had certain assumptions about how I was communicating effectively that turned out to not be effective at all. So when I'm transmitting, sometimes being less direct, asking more questions before getting to the conclusion. And when I'm listening, to be more animated when I listen. I have learned a lot from my partner. She has a much more diverse lived experience than me, and she works in diversity and inclusion. And when we were first together, I often would look sort of blank-faced at her when she was talking to me. And she assumed that meant I wasn't engaged at all. I wasn't listening to her. And no, that I was paying like a lot of attention. It's just that from my military background, and probably more also from growing up that way, it was, you were never very animated, but you were always listening and paying attention. And I would call this my listening for orders face. It was sort of just a blank stare. So I've learned to become more animated, to show more emotion, to be more energetic.
Yes.
It's not something that you would normally do in a controlled, disciplined military environment, but it's necessary to communicate more effectively with a wider range of people.
That is so interesting, isn't it? Because whenever I talk about bias, I say that, it forms often in our formative years from the culture, whatever that culture is. And for you, I would imagine as a young man that you've gone into this culture, which you want to be a pilot, my goodness, living so many boys' dreams to be a pilot, but it comes with a particular culture that then influences the way that you communicate. That it makes a lot of sense, but it's fascinating that then, because you learnt that communication meant this sort of response, like just listen, pay attention, but don't show any response, because I could imagine if you were given a command and you didn't like it and you showed it in the military, that would not be a very helpful thing to do.
No, true, yeah.
Oh, look, that's excellent, Chris. So from your own experience, as you become aware of biases, what's been your experience? Do you find it very easy to deal with them? Is it a backwards and forwards thing? You make, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Do you find that you fall back into like a default position? How have you learnt to handle your own biases and the changes that you've needed to make?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's really hard. It requires continuous work to overcome, to be aware of all of your biases and then to overcome them. And it is definitely a sort of step things. So you'll get to one step and then you try and crawl up to the next step, and you every now and then bounce back to where you are now. And then finally you'll make a progression. If you don't work on it, and I have done this as well, and have to slap myself around the face when I realize I've done it. You just slipped back to the old way. And biases are natural. I think stereotyping and ascribing meaning very quickly, we do from an evolutionary biology perspective. I think our brains are naturally lazy. So if we can skip straight ahead to a conclusion and get on to the next point, our brains want to do that. So we have to fight that continuously. I have found that surrounding myself with people with different perspectives, trying to remind myself to ask questions and listen first, not to do that leap to the, oh, so that's the order, I'll go and do that now, or here's the conclusion, here's the solution. To do those sorts of things and learn as much as possible. That's what I've been trying to do. And from a lot of really fantastic people that I've had the privilege of meeting, I have learned a lot and expanded my experience. So trying to get outside that cloistered, the view that you get from all of the people who are like you. But it's a continuous struggle. I can't say that I will ever be, at the end. And I still get disappoint myself occasionally when I fall back into making an assumption and I realize, oh no, that's just based on some bias or stereotype that you'd formed in your mind and you weren't really listening.
Yeah, look, I totally agree. I feel that almost biases are part of our DNA, often because they form very early in life and they are very much an unconscious part of how we respond. And I loved also what you said about our brains being lazy. And I'm reading a fantastic book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And you've probably read that. And and he talks about, system 1, which is the automatic, the quick, and system 2, which is that really slower thinking. And I'm really glad that you said that, because that's helping me, in a sense, make sense of this quite academic book, which does not sit in, like I've done academic work, but not in this area. So it's causing me to take it slowly, but to connect the dots now for myself and see that our biases fall into that quick thinking, that system 1, but also that we make the decisions around what we do with our biases with that slow thinking, that system 2. And because our quick thinking is our automatic thing, we do slip back very, very quickly. And as you say, our brains are lazy. We would much prefer to take the easy route than the harder thinking route when it comes to making any sort of change.
That's a fantastic book. I love the fact that he gives so many case studies and practical examples of all of the different ways our brain thinks. And I'd recommend that book to anybody. But it's not a very short or an easy read. It's easy read, but it is very methodical.
It is very methodical, and because I'm not like, talks a lot about probability and things, and that just was not my area of expertise in math.
Oh, yes.
But I think from having done academic work in the past, I know that I don't actually have to take in every detail. It's about understanding the ideas behind what's being written.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Chris. So just before we bring our conversation to a close, is there anything else that you would like to add to our conversation today?
Oh, I think we've covered most of what I've seen from bias, I think, and also how it's something that's very evident in the work that I do. So most of the time I focus on helping people be better public speakers or communicators, so they're aware of the filters, those biases they might need to get past, and talk about first impressions, how we can't avoid making them. So people making an impression of whether they should trust you or how competent you are immediately you stand on a stage or in front of them. But it's also, this sort of discussion has also reminded me that we need to think the other way as well, so that when we are listening to other people, or we are interacting with other people, we're putting those filters up as well.
Yes.
And we're not going to get the most out of other people and listen as well if we're not aware that we have these filters, and we've immediately made judgments about another person, possibly because they don't hold eye contact, which could be for a whole range of reasons. It could be cultural, or the way their brain is made up, or a past experience. So we need to be aware of those things when we're listening to other people, and try and put those judgments to one side. So it works both ways, the way that these filters come up through our biases in communicating. And that's something that I've been very conscious of recently.
Well, thank you, Chris. It's been fantastic to have your input into this conversation around bias. And so this is Bron Williams signing off from Bringing Bias in from the Cold. Welcome to this episode of Bringing Bias in from the Cold. I'm Bron Williams, a commentator and facilitator on bias and diversity. And with me today is Tara McGuigan. Hi, Tara.
Hello, Bron.
So lovely for you. Oh, I'm fantastic. And I'm so glad that you could join us. So can you tell us something about Tara, please?
Well, so I live in Melbourne, Australia, and migrated from Sri Lanka in 1988. My husband is Australian, and I've got 2 children. What else? Well, I've lived more of my life in Australia than in Sri Lanka. And yeah, I'm quite happy here. It's a good country.
Good.
But yeah, your topic is bias, so I haven't been particularly aware of bias for a long time. I wasn't conscious of it at all. But I think as I've got older, I'll be 60 this year, and as I've got older, I've probably been more aware or recognized it, because I think sometimes we don't even see bias. We don't recognize it. We don't know it is bias. We just accept it as, oh,
that's the way things are.
That's the way of the world, yeah.
So how would you define bias?
I think bias is the lens that we see certain things through. So for instance, if we're talking of religious bias, it'll be, say, in a Christian country like Australia, it'll be a lens of Christian culture that we see the world through. If you were in the Middle East, it would be Islam bias that you would lens you'd see the world through. So in Sri Lanka, it is a Buddhist bias that they see the world. So and likewise in India, it is a Hindu bias, you know. So that's to do with religion. But of course, there's so many biases. I mean, sometimes I know I used to be biased about men who were not very tall. You know, I used to think, oh, short man syndrome, you know how you say that in your mind?
Yes.
Oh, I used to. And I realized that that's a bias.
Yes. And and that's a friend of mine who is married to a man who is probably 6 inches shorter than she is. She said she struggled with that, and I've certainly come across that in my own life, because that's a cultural thing that somehow says that a man should be taller than a woman.
Yeah.
Though when you think about it, what difference it makes, I don't know.
Yeah. It's these weird expectations. Like I used to have this thing that my husband had to be older than me, you know.
Yes.
So my husband is actually 6 months younger than I am. And as you know, as a young person, I wouldn't have warmed towards someone who I realized was younger than I was, even if it was like a few months. I know, say it was a few years, probably I would have really struggled with that, you know, that would have got in the way of my decision to marry the person. So
that is so interesting that you say that, because as you know, my partner is 3 years younger than me and he's the same height as I am. And so, yes, not so much for me around the age, but certainly the height. And again, that was just a cultural thing.
yeah.
And I love that you've raised that, because they're the lenses, and I like that word that you use. They're the lenses that we filter and interpret everything to, and we categorize people, don't we? If they're tall or they're bigger or their age, we categorize them and say that they are suitable because they've ticked these boxes.
Yeah, it's a pity that it's this training to categorize is instilled in from a very young age, you know, to put things into boxes. And that's that really is a pity, because we lose touch with connecting things. Like, you know, we have to intentionally start connecting the dots, as you say. Whereas I think we are trained, we're taught not to connect the dots, but to operate in silos or in those separate ways. So it's really interesting how you got to unlearn.
Yes.
Now, when you start going into higher education, like when you start done a thesis, you know what it is like. When you start writing a thesis, suddenly you're having to see the relationship between a whole lot of things that you would normally have separated.
Yes.
So your analytical mind will separate these things. But then when you're writing, you know, in academia, you're then supposed to start connecting these things. And sometimes I think, you know, it's such a pity that the systems are set up in such a way. And look, having said that, I believe things are changing. So I want to say that at this point, Bron, because certainly the coronavirus is bringing a lot of change to how we think and operate. And I'm really hoping that it will start to address some of the just unconscious biases that we carry, that we'll start to see them, because those very things that we were biased about will start to affect us. But anyway, what I was trying to say is that it's a real pity that, and you know, because I come from an Eastern culture, it has its benefits as much as a Western culture does. And in the Eastern culture, it's a much more holistic way of looking at things. So we tend to be more accepting, say, of things, or more encompassing of things.
So less silos.
Less silos. Whereas the Western mind, we are taught to, or don't mix it all up, like separate it out and just focus on this issue and not all those other things, and take them separate. And sometimes one issue has the bearing, it is coming from multiple places on that particular issue. So you take bias. Sorry,
do you think, no, that's all right. Could just to sort of tease that out a bit more, because you know, like you and I have had many, many, many conversations around ideas and thoughts and philosophy. So the idea that the Western mind categorizes, whereas the Eastern mind tends to, as you say, be more holistic. Do you think that's because Western thinking is more that Greek cognitive thing, where we have to sort things out, and we are very strong on cognitive, intellectual, whereas the Eastern mind, although people are still cognitive and intellectual and, you know, incredibly intelligent, they, as you say, make connections, they connect the dots much more readily, or just as a natural part of life.
And I think the Eastern mind is now I just want to clarify, Bron, that in the Eastern countries also you get a lot of bias. So
it's not like it doesn't exist.
But I think the Eastern mind is more readily accepting of life as it comes
Right.
at you.
Yes.
You know, or more readily accepting of people's weaknesses or failures or whatever you want to call it, and doesn't question the way the Western mind would question things. So it's much more about life comes at you this way and you accept it that way. So in a sad way, I think also when, say, a person from Eastern culture, say, migrate to a Western culture, because they come with that accepting way of looking at life, they accept more the bias that if a Westerner migrated to an Eastern place, for example, they wouldn't put up with that kind of bias the way the Easterner would when they migrate to a Western country.
So is it a fact that maybe an Eastern thinker is absorbing the bias as part of the whole rather than saying this does not fit in my boxes, therefore I'm going to resist it?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. The Easterners tend to accept life. They have a different approach to how life comes at us, right, at people. There is less choice for a start. Like, you're born to a family, you live according to the family's rules, and you live in a certain context. You wouldn't think to question that context. I mean, certainly if you look at the Eastern countries, they don't, they're not openly critical of government or, you know, because they'd have to pay a price for that, for a start.
Okay,
and, And also I mean, it's a sad thing, I think, that that happens, and they allow for themselves to face bias. Now, in Sri Lanka, there's the Sinhalese and the Tamils. And one of the first questions I used to have asked of me when if I met Sri Lankans in Australia is, are you Sinhalese or Tamil? You know, that was one of the first questions. And we come to Australia to get away from all of that. You know? So,
and it's still here, it followed you.
That is how ridiculous. And in my case, I'm neither, because I belong to a whole different racial group, which is a very tiny racial group in Sri Lanka.
Well, there you go. I've learned something about you today.
Yeah. Yes. And it used to bemuse me that people come all this way.
Yes.
They come as refugees, mind you, to get away, some of them, but others migrate, to get away from all of that. And then they ask this ridiculous question, you know. So we carry, I mean, even the Easterners, that's why I said, like, you know.
The bias is still there. So do you think, because I find that really fascinating, because you're right, you know, people come to Australia because they are trying to escape or get into a new life, and yet we can't help but bring our biases with us. I often say that bias is like part of our DNA because it has formed in us at such a young age. We've been given these lenses to look through. So do you think, like we talked about categorizing and silos, so categorizing goes on regardless of whether you're an Eastern person or a Western person. But I think categorizing helps us control things, doesn't it? It helps us settle in our own minds where other people fit and where we fit in the world. And that's probably why those questions have been asked of you. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that or negative about that. But I think the issues become when we use those categories as a way to separate us and say one is better than the other. Once we start making moral judgments about all into different groups, and that's where our biases can really become have a negative impact in our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're right. I think I mean, it's good that your work is around and you have acknowledged that sometimes you can't get rid of a bias, but if you recognize, you can catch yourself falling into that trap, and how a bias can actually be so self-sabotaging, because we lose the power of choice and the power of seeing things for what they are. When we apply this bias, we actually harm ourselves more than anyone else when we do that.
We do, don't we? Yeah, because we limit our experience of the world, and we limit the people that we connect with, and we limit
our
the way
experience. Our experience of life can be so much bigger if we allow for those lenses or those biases to be removed. Or see past them.
That's right. Now, you talked about, I'd mentioned that I don't think I can ever particularly do away with bias, but we can mitigate the risks or catch ourselves. So what are some of the things that, when you notice yourself, either you're falling into a bias that you've recognised, what do you do? How do you treat yourself? How do you deal with yourself when you find you're sort of reverting to type?
Self-talk is good for me, because I chide myself and say, can't you see yourself going back into that same old place, I find that works for me. Sometimes I would probably discuss it with a close friend. I mean, often you and I have talked about things, and seek clarity, because we can go with bias, where you can be accommodating of something that is not on. That's the other side of bias.
It is, yes.
So
that's, you were talking about that before, how Eastern thinkers, in a sense, accommodate bias much more readily than Westerners
don't do
do.
themselves a favor, or their children or the other generations coming up, So bias is not acceptable.
No. And I think that's the more one of my real aims with doing these conversations is, as it's called, bringing bias in from the cold so that we can discuss it. I want to demystify it so that I have conversations with people from a variety of backgrounds and life experiences, so that we can see where things are the same and where they differ, but also to sort of normalise the fact that we all have biases, and having bias is a shared experience for all human beings. Because I think sometimes one of the things that stops us from admitting our biases or confronting them is that we actually feel ashamed. We know somewhere in our head that we don't actually want to think badly, or we don't want to categorize people, but we do unconsciously. And so we just prefer not to think about it at all. Whereas if we can say, look, this is actually a normal part of being a human being. It's not a helpful part, but it's a normal part. And then we can just remove some of that shame around it, and then talk about it.
I mean, look, there's another thing I wanted to say about bias, which ties in with what you just said, is that I mean, you're talking of unconscious. People are unconscious. Often people don't mean to be like that. They don't want to be like that. And to be kind of judgmental towards someone in whom you see bias is also not fair on them. There's another way to address it.
Yes.
So one of the really funny things I find is, because my husband is white Anglo-Australian, and because I've lived in Australia a long time, and I've probably got fairly anglicized myself, people will talk to me like people express bias to me, forgetting that I myself am not white Australian, right? So they might talk about, it's so funny, like, so they might talk about migrants are like that, or I don't know, Iranians are like this, or whatever it is, and or they might talk about, or their weird food, or things like that. And it's so funny because I think you forget that you're talking with someone who actually, I don't come from Iran, but I relate very closely with what it would be like for someone who comes from Iran.
That's right. And that you might actually have weird food too.
Yeah. That's right. So you might not food weird, but but these are well-meaning people, right?
Yes.
They're not sitting out to in a weird way, Bron, and this is not again saying it's okay to do that, but they don't mean to hurt people, right? But they are just expressing something that we wouldn't even normally do.
No,
it would be too polite to do.
Yes. And look, I think that's, again, is one of the purposes of my work with bias, is to help people see when they are expressing bias. As you say, most of us don't set out to hurt someone else by the things that we say or do, but because so many of our biases are unconscious, we can hurt people. And so the more we can talk about it, the more we can understand what's going on inside our heads, and that is then being reflective outwards, I think is helpful. Now, we're going to bring our conversation to a close, Tara, and I really thank you for your insights today. And I love the idea around lenses and the difference thinking between East and West. So is there something just that you'd like to leave us with, a final thought?
I think it would be wonderful if this conversation was picked up by organizations, because organizations impact so many people. A company that you work for would impact you. And I think the world will just be a better place if we could just see the biases we have. I mean, it's not just West and East. There's West and West where there's bias.
That's right.
So, and East and East, and it happens everywhere. With your neighbor, you might have a bias about your neighbor.
Yes.
I think this is a really important conversation, Bron, and it needs to be much more in the mainstream and not just something that is an add-on. This sort of conversation needs to be part and parcel of school curriculums, of training for new employees as they come in.
Yes.
It needs to be really extended and bigger. Yeah.
Well, who knows where it's going to go.
Yeah.
So thank you, Tara McGuigan. It's been wonderful having you here on Bringing Bias in from the Cold. I'm Bron Williams.